I've been diving deeply into the topic of polarity, masculine and feminine dynamics, for quite some time. Um, I guess I kind of got started around 2013-ish, maybe, but it was from this very kind of like ethereal cosmic scale.
Mhm.
And then about 2 years ago, give or take, at the end of a uh, unfortunately failed relationship, that kind of urged me to take inventory and kind of figure out where things went wrong. And that's when I started diving into what I would call polarity embodiment. So,
Okay. Well, maybe since you started talking about it, you could just continue and give your sort of perspective. What is polarity embodiment? Like, what are your perspectives on masculine and feminine? What's natural to our species and feminism?
hmm sure. So I think it's absolutely vital to understanding this topic to look at these as archetypal energies first and foremost. Forget about men and women and genitalia and all of that, and just there's masculine and feminine, there's positive and negative, right? This is inherent to nature itself. This is how a battery works,
Right.
you know, and these characteristics are objective, right? They are what they are. Masculine has very specific and objective characteristics, and feminine also has very specific objective characteristics. And so understanding those as kind of like perfect as a conceptual idea before trying to apply these to men and women, because obviously once that happens, then there becomes a lot of subjectivity and spectrum and all of that kind of thing. So, masculine and feminine are very distinct, two separate things. In fact, they're like opposites, but not in a way that means opposing, but that they are actually perfectly complementary to one another, and together they constitute the creative force of everything in existence in the universe, probably including the universe itself. So kind of like the Hermetic perspective, if anyone's familiar with the Kabbalion, and speaking of polarity. So yeah, that's where I think it's important to start is understanding that these energies exist outside of ourselves, outside of, it's not a human construct like a lot of people say it is, and they you can come to know these, right? They are knowable, they are understandable, and by observing those, can we understand more about ourselves and why man and woman exist, because we can't pretend that it's just arbitrary, that there's masculine and feminine and then there's man and woman, but like we can just kind of make up whatever, like it's totally arbitrary. There's no connection between man and masculine, feminine and woman, right? So I mean, I don't want to take too long in my introduction. I want to keep an even flow and give you space to talk, but I'm just trying to think of how I can kind of frame it as far as like at least a decent introduction. I do think that the way I look at it is man is a physical manifestation of masculine energy in the universe, right? Human beings are a physical manifestation of consciousness.
Yes.
So this is how I view things from a spiritual perspective. And so
Yes.
then to dial down, man is the physical like manifestation of masculine. Woman is the physical manifestation of feminine energy, and
Right.
therefore there ought to be, and when I say ought, I'm talking about natural law, right? Humans are free to do whatever we like, but there are oughts
Yeah.
within that of what's going to work out better for us, and typically the underlying current of all of the oughts and the shoulds have to do with just natural law, going with nature rather than against it.
Right.
So that would be kind of my fundamental, is that men ought to embody masculine energy, but in a healthy and balanced way. And I'd love to get into more of that, because that balance is a very nuanced thing. It's
Mhm.
not 50-50, but it's also not just totally masculine, nothing else, right? That's where toxic masculinity, for example, comes into play, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a good place for me to just kind of, let that be my introduction, and I'd love to hear your side of things.
Thank you. That was great. I can't disagree with anything that you said so far. Totally with you. And I also come from kind of an occult and cosmic, perspective. I have a deep dive into Tantra. And so, of course, the whole concept of polarity comes out of the Tantra world. Um, and I am in favor of polarity. I have a lot of polarity with my lovers. Oh, what was the last thing you heard? I was talking about the cult of masculinity, which sort of came out of the polarity space.
I think
And
you're just about to get into when my ability to hear you, you were just about to get into that, but I didn't hear any of that. But
okay, so I was saying that I do believe in polarity. I'm a Tantra coach and have a lot of polarity cultivation in my life. And what I'm concerned about is that I feel that the polarity space has been hijacked by a new cult of masculinity, which is wanting to definitively define what men and women ought to be in order to have polarity. So, sort of like, if you want to have good sex, this is how you have to be. And I'm concerned about the direction this is going. Now, there are a lot of men's groups who are doing good work, and shout out to them. But I am seeing this kind of like new cult of masculinism, which sort of combines even Christians, which is a strange bedfellows between Christians and Tantra coaches, but kind of a huge proliferation of men's coaches who are kind of preaching a cult of what I would say toxic masculinity, which, obviously toxic masculinity is totally distinct from masculinity itself, which is a neutral force, just sort of a force of being masculine. And there's toxic femininity too, which we know is, a big problem in our lives as well. But I would say that toxic masculinity and femininity are basically synonymous with patriarchal conditioning, patriarchal masculine and feminine, which patriarchy, also known as dominator culture, it's kind of a bad word, but it's not about blaming men. It's about a culture, a package of kind of things that have gone together for starting 5,000 years ago: war, genocide, male dominance, and the dominance of some people over others, some ethnic groups over others, and environmental destruction. So it's a conversation that we need to have, and it's a conversation that we need to have without shaming, blaming men, because I don't blame men at all. I love men. It's about an institution or a system, or really a system of habits that is perpetuated by both women and men, and that harms men almost as much as women. And so my book, Before War, on Marriage, Hierarchy, and Our Matriarchal Origins, I've done 30 years of research into how things were before patriarchy and how patriarchy arose, which was basically based on an extreme traumatic event, the desertification at the core of the world from North Africa to the Middle East into Central Asia, which led to the transition from agriculture to herding. And with that, with the hoarding and herding of cows, came the rise of strong men. And that those men wanted to pass on the limited resources now with this sort of traumatic event to their sons. And then we saw the rise of, oh, my sound isn't good. Can y'all hear? Can other people hear me? Anybody in the comments? Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. The rise of this sort of system of violence and intimidation, which then these people, the steppe nomads, who were affected by this extreme traumatic event, domesticated the horse and went on to basically conquer the world. So they were the Semites and the Indo-Europeans. The Semites conquered Mesopotamia, and then created these empires, the Sumer Uruk, all of those. And the Indo-Europeans went on to conquer basically all of Europe. But beforehand, there was Old Europe, which was a civilization that had women at the center that worshipped a goddess, and that goddess worship based on the female figurines actually goes back hundreds of thousands of years. And in the hunter-gatherer times, women were hunters, women were shamans, and then women would have been at the center of inventing agriculture as also the gatherers, and also ceramics, and basically the arts of civilization, which were all in place in the old European civilization from about 7,000 BC until 3,500 BC, when the Indo-Europeans invaded, and that's when we start seeing violence, individual burials, much newer people with much taller people, bigger heads. Those were the Indo-Europeans, and they basically eliminated the entire indigenous male genome of Western Eurasia very quickly. Genetics tell us that the Y chromosome lineage went from dozens to just two, R1A and R1B. And with the arrival of this genetic lineage, we have violence and war and paternity, so passing the lineage from father to son instead of from mother to daughter. And when that happens, we have sexual repression, because if you need to know who your father is, you always know who your mother is. If you need to know who your father is, then you have to suppress sexuality, and with that comes psychopathology, because sexuality is so core to our being. So from there, we see basically the spread of patriarchy all over the world, although there are many places in the world where people fled into the hills or into the islands. So there was a last gasp of an patriarchy in the Greek islands, which culminated in the Minoan civilization, which here's a sort of a Minoan priestess, was extremely peaceful, advanced civilization with flushing toilets, and women were, based on the imagery, in charge. And then there was kind of the end of the Bronze Age was basically revenge against the patriarchy. The sort of matriarchal remnants that were left over attacked these empires. They're known as the Sea People, and brought these empires down, caused a dark age. When we came out of the dark age into the classical Greek times, and I'm almost done with the spiel, the Minoans were basically forgotten, but they were the cornerstone of ancient Greece, which is the cornerstone of our Western culture. They integrated a lot of the things of the Minoans, but the female history was written out of history as propaganda, patriarchal propaganda, and mythology was written to cast women as inferior and convince people of the rightness of the new male order. And so within the next 5,000 years of sort of propaganda and erasing women's history, we have come to be convinced that men are meant to be dominant and women are meant to be submissive, and that men represent logic and order. So these ideas about it, and these are all coming back into vogue, and we have to look cross-culturally, including at the matrilineal people who did survive patriarchy all over the world in the fringes, and I visited a lot of them. And what we see is a much different concept of what masculine is and what feminine is. So if we're deciding what is, like you say, objective and universal and cosmic about the masculine and feminine, we need to understand that we have to look at all cultures if it's going to be truly universal. So that's my spiel.
Okay, yeah. Oh man, there's so many different ways we could go with that. I'll actually address the last thing that you said, because that stood out to me. I think personally, a better way to instead of observing cultures in human nature, we observe nature itself and then model our behavior off of what we're seeing. Not that we act like animals, that's a misinterpretation of like living in alignment with natural law. It's observing nature, but then applying our intelligence to it and being able to discern like what is a better way, what's not a better way. But in this context, just observing patterns of like what is masculine energy, feminine energy, and these sort of things. And again, from the kind of esoteric perspective of, the elements, for example, having different masculine and feminine qualities. Water being feminine, water is associated with emotion. It's receptive, right? You can literally store information inside of water. These similarities are not simply arbitrary, and but I think what's also really important to stress here when talking in context of this is that uh, being submissive, for example, to be a receiver doesn't make doesn't mean inferior. That's a misconception. I also want to say I totally agree with you that polarity is being hijacked. This whole like new wave of like these Andrew Tate type. I know that's like perfect. He's the poster child of that, and it's just
Exactly.
it's abhorrent. It's absolutely disgusting. But even a broken clock is right twice a day, as they say. He does nail certain aspects when he's talking about it, but then he mixes in all sorts of other stuff as well. So looking to him to and think that's what polarity is, that is a terrible place to start or to correlate these ideas essentially. So um, yeah, I think maybe we can kind of start from coming back to these principles themselves. Like I said, they have to be aspects of energy because that's what they are. They're energies. Energy is kind of a hard thing to define, but it's kind of like a force or a it's either a force or a potential for force, which is something that kind of creates change. It's something that interacts with its environment and has an effect on it, right? That's kind of like how I would define energy. So, and the reason that's hard is because, like, masculine energy is more like a force, right? Because it's penetrative, it's forceful in a way. It's kind of like dominant, right? But then, like, the feminine energy is more like the pure potential. It's like a whole cloud of possibility. It's the womb. It's literally the womb. It's the empty space that holds all of creation within it. You know what I mean? I know that might seem very like woo woo and just sort of like all out there, but I mean, you have to start from these kind of big picture cosmic aspects and then dial it down to the human level from there. So, like, to give or project and to receive, these are opposites, but they literally go together. And so to like be assertive is one energy, and then to be submissive is the other end of the same thing. But one is not good or bad. It's only becomes that if it's not grounded in love and true authentic connection. So like, that's literally the difference between making love and a rape is, it's the same physical action, but there's consent, there's care, there's, connection and all of that intertwined in it. And that's what actually makes them different. So that's, I think, a really good way to distinguish how male leadership, for example, doesn't have to be oppressive. It doesn't have to mean slavery. It doesn't have to mean patriarchy to go ahead and speak to that term. But well, I've said a lot there, so I'll give you some space because I've got a lot more too.
Okay, I'll respond to some of those points. So I think we need to really just unpack all of our ideas about what the nature of masculine and feminine is. So, for example, when you talk about the feminine as receptive and the masculine as penetrative, that is not how it is expressed in the original tantric texts, which actually come out of South India, which was the Indus Valley, like a matriarchal civilization that was invaded by the Indo-European Vedic people, and basically that civilization was sort of assimilated. The original tantric texts, which remained kind of female-centric until recently, talk about the female as engulfing the male. So it's a total shift in how we think about it. If the female is on top and is taking the sort of initiative actions to engulf the male, it's a total shift in how we think about it. And as far as nature and looking at animals, we are animals. I think we are nature. And so when you look at primates, our closest relatives, chimps, our closest relatives, there's many different kinds of primates with different social organizations. And it comes down to what they call sexual dimorphism. So if an animal has an extreme amount of sexual dimorphism, meaning the male is much bigger than the female, then they're going to have a dominance hierarchy where the alpha male takes all the females and dominates the females. Whereas if there's not much sexual dimorphism, like you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a female gibbon and a male gibbon, then they tend to be more pair bonding. So there's not a dominant hierarchy. But chimps are such an interesting thing because we've been focusing on our similarity to the common chimp, which has a certain dominance hierarchy, although much more so in our studies because we provide like a limited stash of bananas that they fight over. And with a limited stash of resources is what encourages patriarchy. Chimps, that's kind of a funny thing to say. But somehow we're not looking at the bonobo, chimp, which is much more related to us because, like us, the bonobo doesn't go into heat, or they're sexually receptive more throughout the cycle, so they have a lot more sex, and that's a very significant characteristic. And the bonobo is female dominant. It doesn't have much violence compared to common chimps. So there's many different animal models we can look to, and we're all different. But humans have sexual dimorphism that's between gorillas on one hand and gibbons on the other. So we can go either way, and we have gone either way. But as far as male leadership, I'm all for males being leaders. It's just that we also need to allow for women's leadership. And when we come back into a balance where women make up at least half of leaders, because the data does say that women CEOs and mayors are more successful than male counterparts, not only in terms of the people under them being happy, but the bottom line. And individual women leaders that have made it to the top, the Hillary Clintons and Margaret Thatcher tend to be just as warlike as the men. But if we did find more of a balance where women were working with other women in large numbers, I believe that we would find more of a balance where there would be less war out there.
Man, what a juicy topic. Because, yeah, I mean, first of all, it's like, starting with psychology, you have the left and right hemispheres of the brain, which I would say also have a correlation to the left side being masculine, the right side being feminine. We can, or anyone can contest or debate that, but that's where I'm coming from. And so that's kind of like where biology meets the energetics. Mm-hmm. And so essentially the left brain is the masculine side that's more concerned with survival. So you always hear survival and reproduction, right? Those are kind of the masculine and feminine aspects to humanity, right? And to propagate the species and make sure we don't die off. And so, like, that's why it makes sense that the masculine side is like, the provider archetype, builder, protector, things like that. And the female is more oriented with the village and cohesiveness and caring and things like that. So I do agree that the world, I don't subscribe to the word patriarchy necessarily, but I do agree that we have anarchy, right? And that in itself is a problem, right? Because I'm an anarchist. I believe that human authority doesn't actually exist, at least when it's backed by violence, right?
Right. Right.
And so, yeah, that's one whole big thing right there. But when you have a world that's built on scarcity, because it
Right.
is definitely constructed to be the rat race that keeps people in their left brain dominance, in their survival mindset, where we don't have a moment to kind of rest and digest and let that, sympathetic nervous system kind of do its thing and all of that stuff.
Mm.
Or parasympathetic, I mean. And so you have a scarcity mindset cultivated in every aspect, from like the way the money is created and manipulated and inflated to where you have to do more just to even break even and all this kind of stuff. And you add that to hierarchical systems, then of course a female that is entering into that world is going to have more what I would call masculine energy, or masculine traits. Again, that's kind of the gray area between biology and energy, but I think keeping it to energy helps kind of keeps things more succinct and able to just keep focus, because that's where you get in the weeds, is like some men are like this, some women are like this, but the energies are what they are. And so, then you have your Hillary Clintons that are warlike and they're assertive and dominant and all of those kind of things, which again is a masculine energy, but I would say she is more of an embodiment, and like others who would have those tendencies of toxic masculine. So maybe I can quickly say what I think that means,
Mm-hmm.
because as I said in the beginning, we do need balance. That's extremely important. You observe like the yin yang, that is there's both, but even if you say white is one, gender, and the black is the other, there's still that little speck of the other contained within. It's not a 50-50 ratio. It's just a little bit to offset. And you can see this even in like a healthy male is mostly testosterone, but if you have zero estrogen, that's going to cause a lot of issues, right? So that's another, what I mean when I say observing nature. We can see these like reflections, and using our intelligence, see like how things are meant to operate according to natural law. So all that to say, what toxic masculinity is pure testosterone, without any heart-based intelligence, without care of the person you're dominating or leading or whatever you want to call it. But if you're dominating them against their best interest, their consent and all of that, it's not leadership, it's tyranny. And that's exactly what the government itself is. And I know, it's a very, like, people in my audience, people in your audience, probably there's a mixed bag, but many people, the vast majority of people, think anarchy is chaos. They think those mean the same thing. And so that's a whole other thing, and I don't want to detract too much from that. But I do think it has a place in this conversation, because even when we use words like patriarchy and matriarchy, well, what is archy? Archy comes from the Greek word archon, which means ruler, right? So that means that it kind of implies hierarchy by design. But to me, hierarchy isn't bad unless it's coercive. It's actually the only way you can get things done in certain capacities, because you have to have somebody like is the final word on certain decisions. That's based on authority that they actually have, right? If I
Right.
decide I want to build a house, I put a team together. I
Yes.
have the hierarchy because it's my project, but no one is forced. Like if they don't want to be part of it, they're free to leave, and that's all good, right? It's only
Right.
when, hey, well, you owe me taxes and all of this kind of stuff comes in, and you can't opt out of the system.
Right.
That's not an option.
Right. Cool. That was great. Thanks. So I made some notes. So to start with your last point about hierarchy, I believe that hierarchy is good if it's based on merit. So
Mm-hmm.
like you say, so like hunter gatherers traditionally before patriarchy would have different leaders come to the fore during different times. So if you're good at building, then you're going to be the leader for this building. But then they had a system, many hunter-gatherers have been observed as making fun of the leader afterward to make sure that they didn't get a big head and think that they were going to take over. So there's all these checks and balances in place to make sure that no leader gets too big for their britches. Hierarchy, in my view, is bad when it becomes inherited. So if it's like just based on being male, or just based on being white, or just based
or
on
female.
Right. And so the term matriarchy is confusing because it does have this archy. So most people assume that it means females are dominating males, which in all my study of this, I've only seen one culture where that seems to have been sort of true, the Minoans, because all of the images show women with beautiful skirts and exposed breasts basically being worshipped by men in loincloths. So it does look like that might have been a culture where men were sort of decentered in a way that maybe wasn't healthy. But for most of the record that we have, it was egalitarian. So there wasn't a hereditary leadership where somebody inherited the leadership from their family. Like it was all the houses were the same size in whole Europe. Even the Minoans, even if they did sort of marginalize men, there was no violence among them, and the sort of public money went towards making everybody's lives better. So there wasn't, like in all the other Bronze Age empires that were highly patriarchal, a lot of rich over poor that you don't see in the Minoan. So that's sort of the archy, is hereditary hierarchies as opposed to hierarchies of merit. And then to go back to the left and right hemispheres, it actually so happened that I started life in neuroscience and spent 5 years working in a lab where we tested split brain patients to look at the sort of left hemisphere, right hemisphere thing. And I'm not all that convinced by that. I mean, men and women's brains, when you look at them, like you can't really predict which is which. Like our brains are not really different. Maybe women's corpus callosums, the connection between them is a little thicker. Maybe we're a little bit more integrated between the two. It's very subtle, and so we can't really make any, that's all kind of just a subtle archetypal thing that we can't really make any predictions about. And then to your point about men being builders, we have a lot of cultures where women actually built the houses. So the Zuni in the Southwest United States, can't necessarily assume that, although having built a lot of shit myself, I actually do believe that even in a post-patriarchy where women were raised to have the same level of confidence and the same assumption that we're capable of things and we're mentored to, cultivate our building skills, I think we'd be way better builders. But I still think in a post-patriarchy that men are going to be a little bit more technical and women are going to be a little bit more verbal, and more spatial. But, and then to your point about men being providers and protectors, that's definitely not something that predates patriarchy, because before a matrilineal culture, and many of those survived into the modern day, the whole clan, the grandmother, the aunts, and the uncles provided for the children. So there was no concept of man provider. The whole clan provided for the whole clan, and women were usually at the center of controlling the resources from the perspective of a grandmother. So a grandmother is going to provide for, it's not going to be this kind of leadership based on power. Like you said, like that's the negative archy, is power over. This, like Iroquois confederations in the Northeast United States, grandmother councils, which appointed leaders. And so this whole concept of providing wasn't like men provide and women receive. It was like everybody provided for everyone. And before this rise of violence, there was nothing to protect against. So this whole concept of man, the protector, and the provider is very recent, in human times. We kind of need to we can't necessarily assume those are masculine traits because it's a recent concept, so it's not there.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And this is why I keep kind of coming back to keeping the archetype first and then applying that to men and women. So
Right.
again, uh, you have give and receive. These are two separate things that are opposite, but you can't, like, giving is meaningless if there's nothing to receive it, and you can't receive if there's nothing being given, right? They
Right.
need each other. And so I think when it comes to applying polarity in human endeavors, whether it is, I think it's most applicable in intimate relationships, but really, I think full embodiment comes down to just not only how you interact with everyone, but even just the world, how you show up in the world, um, eh, then you can apply, like, that projection as a masculine and that receiving as a female. It does. I get what you're saying. When you're looking at cultures and especially the evolution of societies, when things were much more village and tribe oriented instead of individual families, then I can see where people can say, well, that's just one of those nuclear family things that is only less than a century old. I get that, but again, if you're looking at it from the flow of energy, I think that's the best way to apply polarity and use it as a blueprint for kind of like, what would you do in this situation or that situation? It's like, well, which one is penetrative energy and which one is receptive energy? And I also think it's important to just say that these are guidelines, and everyone, it's up to each individual how they want to play the game. If they want to ignore it completely, or follow it strictly like it's a religion or something. Personally, I think both of those are a little bit unhealthy, a little bit extreme. But yeah, it's kind of like you learn the rules so you can learn how to bend them like an artist, that sort of thing. But this is a universe of laws. There are rules that are not man-made that just dictate what is best. But whether it's how we eat, or that's a good example. But what I was going to say is, um, well, I did want to refer to even just like observing the genitalia and how they work together, right? So that in of itself tells you so much about how polarity operates. What are these characteristics? You have the phallus, which is projecting. It's penetrating. It's forceful, but in a good way, right? Because if it's too soft or it has no drive, right? It's that like virality, that is going to make great sex and leave the woman satisfied and the man as well. And the feminine likewise is soft and inviting. So see, that's where I can point to. It's not about like one doing the leading or the penetrating has all the power, because the man has to be drawn in, because feminine power is magnetic. It's different than the electric power of masculinity that's like a lightning bolt. It's like that, magnetic energy that's drawing you in. That's why men are inspired by beauty. So he sees a beautiful woman, he's inspired, inspirited, inspired intrinsically to rise up, to be better, to build awesome shit and take care of people and protect people. And I think that's why kind of like architecture is another example. And look at what buildings look like now compared to like a couple hundred years ago. That is a very good indication of like how I think both you invert the polarities, and true masculinity and true femininity have been diminished and kind of like almost eradicated in a way. But yeah, it's there's so many directions with this. It's hard to kind of like stay on and even like a continuous thread. Um, I do like the way this is. I mean, we're covering a lot of great stuff here, in my opinion. Um, but yeah, it's not about what people have to do. It's for each individual to find what works best for them. but I do think that we have to acknowledge that we have certain instincts that are innate, and they can be buried under a lot of wounding and trauma. And I do think it's, you can't talk about polarity in these gender roles and all this kind of stuff without talking about the agenda that to me is painfully obvious to confuse, to invert, and distort gender and the power of both the masculine and the feminine. And this is being done not only through indoctrination in the media and in what we're shown is like man to woman and all this kind of stuff, but through the system itself, which is a trauma-based mind control system. So it inherently contains trauma that distorts the sense of self and where your boundaries are, and whether you because when we sustain trauma, we tend to overcompensate and then direct that vitriol either inwardly or outwardly. And then you have masculine and feminine. Feminine is internal or inward, and masculine is external. So this is again where the toxic version of both of those come from. The toxic masculine is directing that externally, and then you're what? A dick. Well, what does that signify? You're going around, being a dickhead to everyone and dominating everyone because you're externalizing that. Or the other one is just as bad, maybe less destructive to others, but certainly harmful to yourself, is to turn that inwardly and either say, I deserve this abuse, or, I don't deserve to say no, maybe, like, having no boundaries, kind of becoming that doormat or the victim archetype. Yes. So that creates this dichotomy that we see very much all throughout society of master-slave.
Right.
That's where that comes from, is that trauma is creating an inward-outward dynamic there.
Yeah.
And the last thing, just to finish up, is then there's like the chemical warfare, right, through pesticides and plastics and all sorts of other things that are further confusing gender and disrupting the hormonal system of the body and all of this stuff. In my opinion, that's absolutely done intentionally. And so when really evil people are having a plan, it's at least wise to consider that maybe the opposite of that plan might be what's actually good for us.
So we agree about a lot of things. I agree there is an agenda, but the trauma-based mind control is synonymous with patriarchy. And even the agenda nowadays, even if it seems to sort of superficially support feminism, is actually subverting it and infiltrating it. So feminism, the movement, has been infiltrated by these forces with agendas, perhaps to create more income by having two-income families instead of nuclear family, and that benefits the power structure. But ultimately, the power structure goes back to the beginning of patriarchy, and it all is control, maintained by trauma. So the original trauma of this invasion, and then generation after generation of compounded trauma of rape and genocide and violence, keeps people in this controlled thing. And that's why, to heal from patriarchy, we need to heal from trauma. And that whole thing we talk about, the oppressor, the oppressed, the victim mentality, that is created from that. This whole idea that this whole creation of women as victims, which, feminism is a different thing to every single person. And there is no monolithic idea of feminism. I mean, to me, it's just women, the idea that women are human and deserve the same opportunities. That's like all it is. There's a lot of really damaged women who are really angry. And honestly, that anger is a necessary part of the healing, because when you actually read the history of patriarchy and the rape and the slicing off of breasts for adultery and the stoning for adultery and the sexual repression and the way that women, until very recently, until 70s feminism, just within my lifetime, weren't able to have any choices in life and choose who they had sex with, choose who they married, choose whether to have children, enter into any careers. I mean, it's not about blaming men, but there is a point at which we do need to like look at what's been happening for the past 5,000 years and not come from a victim perspective, but come from a perspective of looking at women's accomplishments that, despite the enormous obstacles, have been buried by history. Like, for example, Rosalind Franklin was the inventor of DNA, but her work was sort of taken over by Watson and Crick. Like, that's a story over and over. And so women have come to believe that we really have no history and we really have no value outside of being mothers and staying home. But have been women who have excelled in every field, and women have to be encouraged and respected and given the idea that they can do whatever they want, because they have done whatever they want and are now outpacing men, academically. So it's not about women being victims, but it's about understanding our history and what actually happened. And getting angry is a natural response, but we have to move past that because we have to build coalitions, have men and women, and so not blame men. Men are just part of the system, and it's oppressed all of us. Men particularly have been oppressed by oppression of male emotionality. So little boys being told, boys don't cry, and all of this suppression is extremely harmful to men, which is why we see such high suicide rates, because men aren't encouraged to express their emotions and build, friendships and coalition with other men. So we don't really know when you say there are rules we can ignore, we really can't say without understanding the dynamics of patriarchy and our real history and how women created civilization and acted as leaders, and then later, after the rise of patriarchy, warriors to fight back against it, and queens, and the way that women operate in matrilineal societies that weren't touched by patriarchy, that have no sexual repression, because there's no concept of the father. We have to understand that, like, these rules that we think of are so influenced by this 5,000 years of patriarchal conditioning that we can't really say what they are. Like the whole concept that men are external and women are internal. How do we know that? Like, what's the evidence for
that? Because going back to the energies, we started by talking about the Kabbalion, the second hermetic principle as above, so below, as within, so without. So that is the law of correspondence. So that in of itself is kind of a polarity. That's the beauty of these natural laws, is they're kind of interwoven. There's a bit of each of them in all of them, and so like inner and outer is extremely important spiritually as a concept to understand, and those are counterparts. Right? They give meaning to each other. So it stands to reason that those get put on the qualities. It's because gender, in a lot of ways, is just it's duality. Duality just says this is this and that's that. Gender gets more specific about how they fit together, if that makes sense. What is the relationship between the two, day and night, right? All of these opposite things, but they're kind of just all the same thing in a different way, essentially. So that's what I'm saying. Again, even the genitalia, the male phallus is external, it's outside the body, it's protruding. The feminine goes inside, right? Men are exteroceptive generally. They're concerned with the environment because they're scanning for like lions and things like that, because that's the survival, like I was talking about earlier. The feminine is more interoceptive, about like what's going on inside me, right? In tune with the body, in tune with the feelings, and then in also that of other people as well, that connection aspect. So that to answer your last point, but because we're probably getting towards the end of this, maybe. What I really think I want people to come away with this to ponder is, my personal opinion is that this concept of patriarchy, I'm not going to say it doesn't exist, right? And all of the atrocities that you spoke of, I completely agree. Those things are horrible. They should never happen, right? But my personal opinion is that the whole paradigm of patriarchy and feminism is a misdiagnosis of the problem. It seems like we agree completely on what the problems are. We just have different ideas about what it means and kind of like the package that we put in. So that's why everything that I do, for those not familiar with my work, and I have a platform called the Wizard Factory. The crux, the epicenter of everything that I teach about is always about morality.
Mm.
It is the most important thing that we all need to not only understand but live by. And just so people aren't confused, because there's like this huge debate about subjective versus objective morality.
Mm.
So first of all, to dispel that, it's both. Okay, there are subjective aspects to morality, but there is an objective epicenter. The bullseye of morality is that which is not up for anyone's debate. It is objectively these, and it's basically seven things that you don't do, and everything else is open to interpretation, right? And a little bit more personal as to what's right for you, what's right for, or not right. And so I think that is the true root cause of nearly all human suffering. And if men and women were to stay focused on that instead of this, well, men have all these problems, and well, we women have all these problems, and that's because of patriarchy. Like, to me, it's kind of like it's not something that's getting at the true root causes. Because if we simply, all men and women, understood actual right from wrong and apply this, then all of those atrocities wouldn't happen anyways. Because men do terrible things, women do terrible things on a daily basis. That doesn't mean that like men are bad or women are bad. So it's kind of like a misdirection of like where's the root cause of this, the wrongdoing that is causing all of the victimhood and blaming back at the other person. If we could just get to that roots of it, then that would solve these problems that people are kind of pointing to all these other different things, and at the same time build stronger bonds between men and women, I think, because it's coming together on that common ground of truth. And the law of freedom, which says that freedom and morality are inherently connected and correlated. So as the morality of society increases, so does the freedom. And likewise, the more moral degradation that's happening, look around, it's everywhere right now, and freedom is diminishing. So that is the issue that would actually take care of all of these, like the man and woman debate, and there's all these other things too. Those are symptoms. So instead of like getting together and being like, well, we need to stop fever because fever is causing all these problems, it's like, well, what's the sickness that's causing the fever? The fever goes away when you cure the sickness, right? So that's kind of like the final takeaway,
okay,
based on this topic at large. And that's kind of separate from polarity, because it's like we can get rid of evil, which is the destruction of freedom and the violation of other people, treating them as your property essentially, which leads to slavery.
right.
Then we can hash out all the finer details about what makes the best kind of relationships and what works and what doesn't and all of that.
Yeah, maybe a topic for another day, because obviously there's a lot to talk about. But I would say that the fever that you speak of, the problem is the trauma, the original trauma from this desertification event that's been compounded generation after generation, in the same way that a child who's abused may go on to abuse another child when they grow up. It's like this perpetuated trauma. So even though we're in a time of resource abundance, we still have habits from the resource scarcity, like circumcision, and that just keeps on perpetuating the trauma. And so so patriarchy and trauma, in my view, are one and the same. And once we heal that original trauma, we'll find those patriarchal things diminishing, which is exactly as you said, power over each other, oppression, slavery. Women have been enslaved in patriarchal cultures for 5,000 years, and that's why there's this anger. But anger shouldn't be directed at men, because men didn't do it. They're just part of the system and responding to their own enculturation and assumptions. And so it's like understanding the dynamics of this system, which is all about oppression, anarchy, power over, and slavery. We can understand how to deconstruct those tendencies in ourselves. How do I impose my power on other people, and how do I stop? And so it takes each one of us healing, but also curing this gender imbalance. I mean, we haven't had a single woman president. There's like still 80% men in Congress, more than like 90% in major corporation CEOs. We need to heal this balance, and and just say no more war. Like that's like toxic femininity is really toxic in the sense that women compete with other women and manipulate, and that's kind of toxic femininity. And I've had a lot of problems with that in my life. But if toxic masculinity is creating wars and dropping bombs, that's a really big thing. We need to unpack it all by healing the trauma and unpacking these assumptions about what is our true nature. Like you said, it's true that men's are outside, but if you look at it from the original tantric perspective, as the female engulfing the male, that makes the female the actor and not the passive receptor. Like we conceive of women as only passive, that's not the primordial idea of women, which was fierce and all powerful. The goddess was the most powerful force on earth for hundreds of thousands of years. We have goddess figurines going that back. So if we understand our true history, we can start to heal trauma, which is one of the works that I do involving going into trance to heal trauma. So that's my hope, is that men and women can, heal the division and the blaming and get past all the blaming and just understand how we can build a better world. So maybe we should end on that.
We could.
You want to say something?
It's so hard. Yeah, I mean, Well, you said trauma and patriarchy are one and the same. Can you explain what you mean by that? Because that doesn't make sense to me.
So historically, these traits, this whole package of authoritarianism, because before that, you had, basically like there were very large settlements in patriarchal Balkans, for example, that had up to 50,000 people, but they were nested. So each like little village, and then these all little villages had their own kind of council, and then those councils met with each other. So like keeping to this face-to-face level of accountability, basically. And it's when we see this extreme desertification event that we start seeing male leadership, violence, oppression, and then eventually slavery. So it all kind of comes back to that trauma, which then spread all over the world, even people who didn't have resource scarcity, because contact with that type of traumatized culture basically spreads it.
But so, unless you think that trauma didn't exist before that happened, then I don't see how we can tie those two completely together.
Well, we can't.
You know what I mean?
Trauma existed, but we can say that there was no war, and that violent incidences were rare. And I'm sure people had trauma from earthquakes and, you know, natural disasters and being
Mhm.
mauled by lions. That's kind of different from, you know, human violence.
Right. Well, but see, you just said it. Human violence, not male violence, not female violence. Human violence is what causes trauma, among other things as well. Of course, like you said, natural things happen, but that's not something we have as much control over.
Right.
Right? We can make sure we build bridges really good so they don't crash and
Right.
bad stuff happen. But if a tsunami is going to take out your village, there's not a whole lot you can do about that. But what we do have control over is our behavior and how we treat one another. And that's why I say human morality is the crux. And it's when we violate each other, man or woman, that's what constitutes the trauma that then becomes to perpetuate. So I completely agree with you on that note that trauma begets trauma, hurt people, and so on and so forth. So either way, healing um, is absolutely fundamental. I think we just have different ideas in the paradigm of where the trauma came from and what the root cause is. Because ultimately, I mean, I've had trauma, I'm sure you've had trauma, but we don't go around like, hurting people and dominating people because we know right from wrong. And we are generally moral human beings, right? And I'm a man and you're a woman. And that is coalescent, essentially. So I guess if it makes sense, the point that I'm making is that if we focus on the right from wrong, that's what's going to prevent the trauma from continuing long enough to heal from it and not continue perpetuating it as well. But it is the trauma response itself that causes us to start saying men are the problem or black people are the problem or whatever it is, meat eaters, you know what I'm saying? Like there's no list of boogeymen. There's no shortage of boogeymen nowadays because everyone has a degree of trauma. And they're all looking for something to be the scapegoat.
Exactly.
Instead of looking at what is the thing that's the problem itself, rather than it's like the hand that hit you in the face rather than the glove it happened to be wearing.
Right. But it would be disingenuous to suggest that the majority of physical violence isn't done by men. So that is one of the differences between men and women is men have more testosterone and some estrogen, and that does, and more physical agreement. So,
yeah, I do completely agree with that.
90% male violence, which isn't about blaming men. It's about how do we channel this testosterone and aggression in a positive way, let's say through jousting competitions or something, so that it doesn't, result in rape and domestic violence and
Yeah, and those are all certainly legitimate aspects to it, but to me, that's only constituting part of the problem because physical violence isn't the only thing that leads to trauma, and that's why there are so many men that women that have been hurt by women in other indirect ways or nonviolent ways, emotional abuse, exploitation, and extortion, and all kinds of stuff like that. And those men might get caught in that trap too of blaming women and they're all no good and all this kind of stuff. But again, what is the root cause? Whether it's a physical attack or some more like subversive or indirect violation of sorts that still results in pain and trauma, and that's what's perpetuating it. So again, I think that's probably a good place to leave it. If you want to share something back on that, that is my takeaway is, I think focusing on the deeper levels of what is causing the trauma that causes us to then look for something or someone to blame.
Totally agreed. Let's end on that. Thank you for watching, y'all, whoever came back after the technical difficulties. I think next week I'll just start with my window open so that I don't have that issue. And I really appreciate you. This was wonderful discussion, and I think you're very well articulate, and I really enjoyed it. So thanks again.
Thanks. Likewise. Thanks for watching, everyone. And just if anyone wants to see more of my stuff, you can check out the Wizard Factory on Facebook or on YouTube primarily, where I focus my longer form stuff, and just follow me here on Facebook. And
yeah, check it
you
out.
want to show off your book a little bit?
Oh, yeah, Before War. It's on Amazon and in some bookstores, at least in Asheville. And there's pictures, and it's really funny and sexy. So yeah, check it out.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. This was really fun, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure. Yeah, have a good day. Bye.
You too.